The courtroom fell completely silent when a small boy in an oversized suit walked past the guards, past the whispering crowd, and stood at the defense table where his own father sat in shackles. No one stopped him. No one understood why the judge simply nodded and said, "Proceed." What happened in the next 10 minutes would leave the entire courtroom in tears and free a man everyone believed was guilty for 8 long years. Before we continue, if stories like this move you, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment, and share it with someone who still believes in second chances. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Type your city and country in the comments below. Now don't forget to subscribe to Kindness Corner Stories so you never miss a story like this one. Let's get back to it. 8 years earlier, Daniel Reyes was a mechanic in a small Ohio town, raising his son Micah alone after his wife passed away from illness when Micah was barely 5. Daniel worked long hours at the garage, his hands always stained with oil. But every single night, no matter how exhausted he was, he sat with Micah at the kitchen table. He helped with homework, told him bedtime stories about honesty and hard work, and reminded him constantly that character mattered more than circumstance. Then came the night that changed everything. A convenience store 2 blocks from Daniel's garage was robbed at gunpoint. The security footage was grainy and poorly lit. The suspect wore a dark hoodie similar to one Daniel owned, and a coworker, bitter over a dispute months earlier involving unpaid wages, told police he'd seen Daniel near the store that night. It was flimsy evidence, circumstantial at best, but it was enough for an overworked, understaffed public defender's office to build a rushed case around. Daniel insisted on his innocence from the very first interrogation, but the system moved faster than the truth. He was arrested, tried within 4 months, and despite his desperate pleas, sentenced to 15 years for armed robbery. Micah was 7 years old when his father was taken away in handcuffs. He remembered every detail of that morning. The way his father tried to smile so he wouldn't cry, the way the officers wouldn't let him hug him goodbye. Micah was raised afterward by his Aunt Carol, a kind but overwhelmed woman working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Every single week, without fail, Micah wrote his father a letter, and every week Daniel wrote back from behind prison walls, always ending with the same words, "Never stop believing in what's right, son, even when the world doesn't." But Micah didn't just believe. He acted. At just 9 years old, he began spending his afternoons at the public library instead of playing outside with other kids. He read everything he could find about criminal law, appeals processes, and evidentiary standards, subjects far beyond his age. His aunt thought it was a phase a boy trying to feel closer to his father. His teachers thought it was strange, even concerning, for a child his age to be so consumed by legal textbooks instead of cartoons. But Micah had one question burning inside him that no adult around him seemed willing to ask anymore. If the security footage was too blurry to clearly identify a face, how had anyone been so certain it was his father? He formally requested the case file through the county courthouse, a right technically available to immediate family members of the convicted, and spent months poring over documents most grown adults would find overwhelming and impossible to fully understand. Then he found something extraordinary, something buried in a footnote of an equipment maintenance log, a timestamp discrepancy. The convenience store's security camera clock was running 12 minutes behind the actual, real-world time, a defect never corrected before or after the robbery, and never once flagged during the original trial. If the robbery truly happened when the store's footage claimed it did, Daniel had an ironclad alibi. He was recorded on a nearby gas station's camera across town, fixing a flat tire for a stranded stranger, at the exact real-world moment the crime occurred. Micah brought his findings to a legal aid clinic, folder in hand, papers organized with color-coded tabs. Most lawyers there smiled politely, patted him on the head, and told the 10-year-old boy to let the adults handle serious matters, all except one. A young public defender named Sarah Whitman, fresh out of law school, still idealistic enough to actually sit down and read what this child had brought her. She stayed up 3 consecutive nights verifying his research against original court records. To her genuine astonishment, it was airtight. Sarah immediately filed for an emergency appeal, but there was a devastating catch. Due to a rare procedural technicality, The family had to formally request the reopening hearing themselves before she could formally represent Daniel in court. Daniel's original lawyer had long since abandoned the case and was unreachable, uninterested in reopening old wounds for a client who could no longer pay. Everyone assumed this meant Micah's aunt, terrified of public speaking and unfamiliar with legal jargon, would have to stumble through evidence she barely understood herself. Instead, Micah did something no one expected. He formally requested, through written paperwork Sarah helped him properly file, permission to present the evidence himself, guided by his attorney at every single step. It was legally unconventional, emotionally unheard of, but not technically impossible under the court's discretionary powers. The presiding judge, deeply moved by the sheer volume and precision of the boy's documentation, and struck by the improbability of it all, granted an extraordinarily rare exception. And so, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Micah Reyes walked into a courtroom wearing his father's old necktie, cinched too loosely around a collar 2 sizes too big for his small frame, carrying a folder of evidence he had built with his own 2 hands over nearly 2 years of relentless work. The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney who had successfully sent away dozens of defendants over his career, watched with visible discomfort as this child calmly approached the podium. Nervous whispers rippled through the packed gallery. Daniel, seeing his son standing there so small yet so composed, broke down into silent tears, completely unable to speak. Sarah guided Micah gently through the presentation, but it was Micah's own trembling yet determined voice that read the final, devastating question aloud to the entire courtroom. If the store's clock was 12 minutes slow, and my dad's alibi places him at a gas station at the real time of the robbery, then how can anyone be certain this footage shows him at all? The room went completely, utterly silent. The prosecutor had no answer prepared. The original lead detective, called back to testify under oath, was forced to admit that the store's clock discrepancy had never once been checked or verified, a fundamental oversight buried under the crushing weight of a rushed, understaffed investigation years earlier. The judge called for a recess. When court resumed 2 tense hours later, after independently reviewing the time-stamped gas station footage verified by forensic analysts, the judge did something almost unheard of in that courtroom's history, an immediate exoneration delivered right there on the spot, sparing Daniel the agony of enduring a lengthy, drawn-out retrial. "Mr. Reyes," the judge said, looking directly at Daniel with visible emotion, "the state failed you profoundly, but your son did not." Daniel collapsed into his son's arms as the entire courtroom rose to its feet, applause and tears mixing together in one overwhelming wave. Micah, still that same small boy in an oversized suit, simply whispered into his father's shoulder, "You told me to never stop believing in what's right. So I didn't, Dad. Not once." Daniel Reyes walked out of that courthouse a free man after 8 agonizing years of wrongful imprisonment. Not because of some legal loophole, not because of sheer luck, but because a 10-year-old boy refused to accept an injustice that everyone else around him had already quietly given up on. Today, Micah is studying diligently to become a lawyer himself, personally mentored by Sarah Whitman, the young attorney who once chose to believe a determined child's instincts over an entire room full of skeptical adults. And Daniel, finally free after all those lost years, spends his evenings the exact same way he always did, sitting together at the kitchen table. Only now, instead of homework, they talk quietly about the future cases Micah hopes to take on someday. For people who, like his father once was, have absolutely no one left to believe in them. If this story touched your heart today, please consider subscribing to Kindness Corner Stories. We bring you real, heartwarming tales of justice, courage, and kindness every single week. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the very next story.